The sun never sets on the NES empire. Let's look at peak NES on this special episode of NES Works.
More than 3,000 East Germans have reached the West across this border in the past 3 months.
We've officially arrived at August 1989 in the NES Works chronology. This calls for us to take a moment to pause and reflect on this time in history, how far the NES has come, and how things are about to change.
In August 1989, the NES was nothing less than the face of video games in America. Statistically speaking, no other game console had ever achieved the degree of dominance that NES enjoyed in America, and no console would ever hit this peak again. Formal market reports indicate that the active NES install base represented somewhere between 80 and 90% of the US console market at this point in time. That puts it well ahead of even the Atari 2600 in that console's prime. The 2600, as of 1982, only commanded about 65% of the industry, with the remainder belonging to Coleco, Mattel, and a legion of would-bes and has-beens. The only other system that would ever come close to this sort of domination would be Game Boy, and that comes with a lot of asterisks. Nintendo doesn't distinguish between Game Boy and Game Boy Color sales in their public figures, and Sega keeps sales breakdowns by region close to its chest when it comes to Game Gear. So it's hard to say exactly how Game Boy fared versus its main competitor. Ultimately, Game Boy's greatest dominance of the handheld space came in the late 90s and early aughts, once Sega had tapped out and before Sony jumped in. No one especially cared to compete in that market, besides SNK, a company struggling to survive. This is a marked contrast to how NES fared at the end of the 80s. Looking back at the 80s, you'll recall that Nintendo had gotten a jump start at the outset of the NES's life by entering a similarly depressed space to the one that Pokemon-powered Game Boy Colors ruled. But once NES reminded American retailers that, oh yes, kids actually do love and will buy video games, several significant competitors entered the scrum almost immediately. First, you had Atari, who had never technically gone away. Its consoles and carts had been marked down and put on clearance, but once the NES reignited the US console market, Atari spun its machine back up into action. It sold leftover 2600 consoles as a budget machine, launched the held-over 7800 in 1986 as an NES competitor, and then shipped the XEGS console the following year. It's made for a confusing tangle of options for consumers, and the backward compatibility, though not cross-compatibility, of the 7800 and XEGS mostly served to benefit consumers with extensive libraries of existing games from before the crash, not people out to buy new games. Game fanatics looking for new experiences didn't have too much to look forward to with the Atari lineup, which brings us to our second NES competitor, Sega. Unlike Atari, Sega launched its Master System with a huge library of original titles and up-to-the-minute arcade conversions. And unlike the Atari machines, which ran on hardware dating back to the late 70s, Sega's console handily whipped the NES's visual capabilities. You could push more sprites, bigger sprites, and generate more and more varied colors than Nintendo's console. Sega's weakness was its library's lack of breadth. The Master System offered plenty of strong, great-looking games, but nearly everything that appeared on Master System for the first couple of years of the system's life came from Sega itself. People point to Nintendo's unfavorable and restrictive NES licensing terms as the cause behind this situation, which isn't wrong exactly, but it also doesn't paint the entire picture. In a lot of ways, Sega's third-party problems during the 8-bit era were a challenge of its own making. Both Nintendo and Sega had launched their first consoles in Japan in 1983 with fully self-published libraries. But where Sega insisted on publishing all third-party titles itself, Nintendo decided, or perhaps was strong-armed by Hudson, to open up its platform to external publishers. We saw this on Segaiden and NES Works Gaiden. Powerhouse publishers like Namco, Konami, and Jaleco tested the waters on SG-1000, but they all abandoned the SG-1000 in favor of the Famicom, where they could publish their own games. Nintendo parlayed this into a huge advantage when it launched the NES in the West a few years later. The company incorporated a lockout chip into the American console and made an arrangement with third parties. They could self-publish on NES, but they had to allow Nintendo to manufacture their cartridges for them. Meanwhile, even after the SG-1000 relaunched as the upgraded Mark III, Sega continued to control its own publishing pipeline. Only 2 third-party titles would ever ship in Japan for Mark III. To make matters even more challenging, the SG-1000's hard reset into the Mark III basically zeroed out the Sega library. Where Nintendo and its third parties arrived in America with years of Famicom software to draw upon, the Master System could only pull from the Mark III library, a console that shipped in Japan a few days after the NES had debuted in America. Nintendo also made some canny distribution deals in the early days of the NES. Although the tale of how Nintendo forged ahead with autumn 1985's New York test market launch all on its own feeds into the lore of the company as a plucky little upstart, the truth is they were well established and had lots of connections. Nintendo quickly forged a distribution deal with Worlds of Wonder, an American company that specialized in electronic toys like Teddy Ruxpin. Worlds of Wonder helped Nintendo reach nationwide saturation within a year, at which point Nintendo ditched them and went solo. Sega followed suit by negotiating an even more involved deal with toymaker Tonka, but it came too late to make a difference. And Tonka frankly had no real clue as to how to sell electronics and video games. And so by late 1987, Nintendo was the hot toy in America. Seemingly every kid had an NES, or else had a friend who owned one, and the console library consisted of a perfect blend of familiar licenses, tentpole Nintendo titles, and all new creations for the more adventurous player. The sheer success of the NES had a halo effect that extended into other media. The golden age of arcade and console games in the early 1980s had seen the arrival of tie-in media and merchandise for hits like Donkey Kong, Pac-Man, and Q*bert, but NES merchandising made that nonsense look like a modest grassroots effort by comparison. Nintendo happily licensed out its properties to any taker, fidelity to the source material be damned. By the time Nintendo Power debuted in summer 1988, the US market had become saturated with Nintendo-themed products for kids, generally bearing Mario's mug. This of course coincided with the US launch of Super Mario Bros. 2, which has the somewhat amusing side effect in hindsight of creating disproportionate representation for that oddball take on the Mario universe within vintage merchandise. But Mario, his sibling, his friends, and his foes were omnipresent in 1988. On t-shirts and other clothing items, on bedding, molded into shampoo bottles, emblazoned on school supplies, and more. Mario also became cheap electronics, like kid-friendly AM and FM radios, as well as the star of a string of early reader books like Trapped in the Perilous Pit. If you wanted a product that could be sold to kids on the cheap in 1989, chances are good that you could find a version of that item that involved Mario somehow. The skew of these products speaks to the way video games were categorized and viewed during the NES era, as stupid playthings for young children. As someone in my early teens at the time, most of the product marketing for the NES passed me by. If you were old enough to shave, you were old enough to wash your hair without needing the bottle to look like Mario or Princess Toadstool. Nintendo also happily licensed the NES to be part of a nutritionally unbalanced diet. The NES universe made its way into lunchboxes in the form of Luigi-shaped pasta, as ice cream bars peddled by eerie vans cruising slowly through suburban neighborhoods in search of children, and of course, as breakfast cereal. Ralston's Nintendo cereal system was a fixture of many a sugar-addled child's breakfast spread for a couple of years. Although it wasn't Nintendo's first run at licensing their characters to a bowl of extruded corn paste, Donkey Kong had started in his own cereal years earlier, Nintendo's cereal system had novelty going for it. It shipped in a divided box, with each side representing a different game, Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. I have to assume this cereal was largely indistinguishable from countless other Lucky Charms knockoffs, but the point wasn't the quality of the food, being served as it was to young, unsophisticated palates, but rather the fact that the box doubled as an advertisement to hype kids up into a consumerist frenzy. Kids in 1989 could spend as much time playing around the NES as they could actually playing it. Nintendo became something of a lifestyle for the truly invested. Topps sold wax pack NES trading cards emblazoned with art and tips for top NES titles. Both Captain N the Game Master and the Super Mario Super Show debuted in September 1989, bringing video game characters into syndicated US animation for the first time in half a decade. For the more literate among the youth set, print publications were waiting in the wings for a 1990 debut in the form of Valiant Comics' Nintendo Comics system, and the ubiquitous book fair standard that was FX9's Worlds of Power novelizations of hit NES games. Or you could just play NES games on the go with 1988's line of Game & Watch handhelds based on NES standards like Balloon Fight, Super Mario Bros., and The Legend of Zelda, which were joined by similar third-party handhelds by Konami and Tiger, based on modern titles like Simon's Quest and Wizards & Warriors. There were even videotapes offering advice on how to beat the hottest NES games. The NES didn't exist alone in the US market, but it might as well have. No one was making How to Win at Atari 7800 videotapes, or selling Alex Kidd-shaped shampoo bottles, or making comic books about Zillion. Well, not about the game anyway. Of course, nothing hyped up the kids quite so effectively as the aforementioned Nintendo Power, which neatly embodies the state of the games market at the time. When Nintendo Power debuted in summer 1988, there were literally 0 video games magazines on the US market. The handful of magazines that covered games did so from the perspective of home computers. The video game-focused magazines that cropped up around Atari 2600, such as Video Gaming Illustrated and Electronic Games, had folded in the wake of the Atari crash. Only PC-focused publications like Computer Gaming World survived into the latter half of the 80s, and they didn't squander their precious column inches on console games. Not that there were console games to cover. The only publication to carry a torch for consoles during the Atari-Nintendo interregnum of the mid-80s, Computer Entertainer, spent much of that time lamenting the fact that there were simply no console releases to cover. By the time the NES made its initial New York debut, with considerable anticipatory FOMO by Computer Entertainer's editors, who operated from California and openly envied New Yorkers' opportunity to score an actual new video game system over the course of several issues, several months passed without a single review of a new console release in Computer Entertainer. Nintendo Power jump-started the US games magazine business. Initially launched as a quarterly free newsletter called Nintendo Fun Club News, Nintendo Power shifted to a larger, bi-monthly format in order to more effectively hype up new releases. Nintendo Power also strived to create a sense of culture around NES games, featuring softball interviews with minor celebrities who played NES, showcasing Nintendo's helpline staff, and creating various forms of town squares, where readers could write in, compete, and contribute. Headed up by Nintendo of America's marketing staff, Nintendo Power drew heavily upon the help of Japanese publisher Tokuma Shoten, who had scored a nationwide bestseller in Japan with the Super Mario strategy guide that Nintendo of America reprinted here as How to Win at Super Mario Bros. Inoue also reprinted Tokuma's Zelda strategy guide, carrying over all the materials directly from the Japanese version of the book, including screenshots with the disk system version's thin font and all Japanese language text blacked out. I have no doubt that observant Zelda fans who owned the book noticed the minor difference in screenshots from the US release. Intrigued, yet unaware of the nature of the Japanese ROM until many years later. This was precisely the sort of cultural localization quirk of the 8-bit era that resulted in playground rumors and deep-seated obsessions that led to ends like middle-aged people running fan wikis and creating retrospective YouTube videos decades later. Nintendo Power initially shipped as a subscriber-only publication, though it eventually appeared in newsstand editions. By that point, though, it had to compete with the mini-gaming magazines that its launch helped bootstrap into existence. December 1988 saw the arrival of Video Games and Computer Entertainment, a fairly dry publication that split its focus between console and computer games. Its quirky perspectives and omnivorous approach to games coverage rendered Computer Entertainer obsolete, but more importantly, it provided a more measured take on NES software that drew heavily on tastes and perspective informed by Western game design over the NES's predominantly Japanese aesthetics and design choices. The following spring saw the 1-2 punch of Electronic Gaming Monthly, a dense multi-format magazine that brazenly lifted much of its format, and sometimes even its screenshots, from Japan's weekly Famitsu magazine, and GamePro, a slick-looking but deeply superficial console-focused publication. Perhaps nothing speaks to the NES's popularity like the fact that it managed to support more gaming magazines by the end of 1989 than the Atari 2600 and its competitors had sustained during the so-called golden age of console and arcade gaming. Of course, the reality is that these new magazines didn't have to sustain themselves on NES coverage alone. The NES certainly offered more than enough material to fuel a games-focused publication, as seen in Nintendo Power, but in the early going, you still saw reviews for Master System and even Atari 7800 in competing publications. These magazines arrived on the cusp of a massive change in the American market. By the time GamePro and EGM and VG and CE settled into their routines, the NES's competition loomed large on the horizon. Summer 1989 saw the NES reach the peak of its power. The system rode high on a growing library built on all the essential pillars. Strong first-party titles like Super Mario 2 and Zelda 2, well-crafted games based on popular licenses like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and DuckTales, interesting arcade ports like Strider and Guerrilla War, best-in-class sports games like Baseball Stars and Tecmo Bowl, ports from PC like Defender of the Crown and Nobunaga's Ambition, and groundbreaking original creations like Mega Man 2, Dragon Warrior, and Fazanadu. The NES seemed all but unstoppable, at least for the ages 6 to 16 cohort. But the rest of the world was about to give it their best attempt. August 1989 would be the single most momentous month the US games industry had ever seen. In addition to a raft of top-flight new NES releases, August also saw the launch of new consoles. Not one console, not even 3 consoles. A staggering 4 new game machines hit stores that month, each one jockeying to establish itself ahead of the 3rd consecutive holiday season in which the NES was bound to be the hottest toy in America once again. First, we had the handhelds. I've already talked plenty about Game Boy, and I covered the Atari Lynx's launch in reasonable detail years ago. Both of these devices brought the NES revolution into the portable space, allowing you to play games that looked and behaved a whole lot more like modern console and arcade releases than the aging Game & Watch line could manage. Game Boy naturally offered a direct NES analog, while Lynx, having been wrested from Epyx's control by Atari Corp., had a lot of cool ideas and tech, but demonstrated the usual Atari Corp lack of vision for its central strategy. More significant than the handhelds were the NES's first true competitors in the US television console space, Sega's Genesis and NEC's TurboGrafx 16. Both of these machines had their own distinctive strengths and weaknesses, which I'll get to in time, but both offered a much greater threat to Nintendo's dominance than Atari's ragtag collection of vintage consoles or Sega's mismarketed Master System. The Genesis and TurboGrafx 16 offered vastly more processing power than the NES, and both had impressively rich libraries of existing content to draw on for localization from their versions already available in Japan. Indeed, the TurboGrafx 16 had genuinely put a dent in the Famicom's share of the Japanese market, where it shipped under the name PC Engine, boasting an extensive library of great-looking and highly innovative games, and powered in part by a sense of resentment by spurned Nintendo licensees like Namco and Hudson. The PC Engine offered a breath of fresh air for Famicom owners weary of aging graphics and cut-rate, opportunistic design. The Genesis, aka Mega Drive, had arrived in Japan a year later than the PC Engine, and so had yet to establish itself to the same degree as NEC's console. But you didn't have to strain yourself to see its appeal. Running on a basic version of the same Motorola processor that powered Sega's cutting-edge arcade machines, and which you could find in graphics-focused home computers like the Amiga and Macintosh, the Genesis promised a direct arcade-to-home pipeline for the likes of Space Harrier and Altered Beast, not to mention a port of Strider that actually looked and played like, Strider. The NES had swept its way to success through a combination of fortuitous timing and clever, sometimes cutthroat strategy, but its underlying tech dated back nearly a decade to 1981 when Masayuki Uemura and his team had embarked on designing it. Sega had the next generation juice, and by the end of 1989, their machines both boasted libraries that hit on most of the same pillars that propped up Nintendo. The NES would of course continue to thrive for years to come, but as of August 1989, things had changed. Nintendo no longer owned the American console gaming market, and they couldn't just dismiss the competition as rabble aimlessly chattering in the background any longer.
It's been a long, nostalgic road covering these past 4 years of NES games. But moving forward, it's going to be increasingly necessary to have a look at the competition to see what other companies like NEC, Sega, and SNK are fielding against the NES. But before we take a look at those high-tech competitors, we need to wind the hands of time back just a little bit and see the road that Sega took from Master System to Genesis. Please look forward to it.